Hello and welcome to Frost Over the World. Later in the programme, I'll be talking to the former head of all the NATO forces in Afghanistan. He's just back, General David Richards. And to the front man of the WHO, Roger Daltrey. But we begin with Israel. On Monday, US Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice will be holding talks with Palestinian President Abbas and Israeli Prime Minister Olmert. The summit comes hot on the heels of a deal between the Palestinian factions, Fatah and Hamas, to form a unity government, and of continuing tensions at Jerusalem's Al-Aqsa Mosque. To discuss that delicate situation in Israel, I'm delighted to be joined by the man who's been described as the most controversial politician in Israel. And I don't know whether the correct form of address, should it be, do you think, former Prime Minister, or would you prefer future Prime Minister?
Well, how about both?
Okay.
David?
Former Prime Minister, future Prime Minister, could I start by asking you about, well, the Palestinian representative in London told me last week that there's now no excuse for Israel and the US not to deal with a Palestinian unity government, following what went on at Mecca. I presume you do not agree.
Well, unfortunately, I didn't hear from in Mecca that Hamas is willing to recognize Israel, is willing to abandon its goal of destroying Israel, and I didn't even hear of one word, not even one syllable in the Mecca agreement about fighting terror and dismantling the terror organizations. These basic commitments of recognizing Israel and fighting terror is what the international community, including the quartet, set as the first part of the roadmap, and there's not a whisper about that in Mecca. It's an agreement between the two Palestinian factions, but it doesn't move them any closer to peace with Israel, and that's unfortunate because Palestinian people deserve peace, and the only way to get there is to make the steps towards peace.
Yes, they do say, of course, that they claim that, in fact, it's implicit in that agreement that by recognizing the agreements that the PLO have undertaken with Israel, that is an implicit recognition of Israel.
It's one of those techniques that diplomats use not to say things. In other words, they recognize the fact that agreements exist. Okay, that doesn't make them recognize the agreements themselves. And for God's sakes, if they agree to abandon the goal of destroying Israel, just say so. It's so simple. There is, I would say, there is an inherent conflict that is being, for the moment, adjudicated here in the Palestinian society, but I believe throughout the Middle East and the Muslim and Arab world. It's a battle between the militants and the moderates. And so far, the militants are winning. And unfortunately, the results of the Second Lebanon War did not help the moderates, I think. It's important to have the moderates stand firm and say, we are going for peace. We want to move from backward regimes as in Iran to forward-looking regimes. We want for the Palestinians not to have this backward militant Islamic regime, but an open regime that will embrace the future and peace with Israel. The same thing in Lebanon. They don't want to Hezbollahize Lebanon. They want, many Lebanese want a forward, prosperous, peaceful Lebanon. That is really what is taking place here. And now there's a hiatus in this battle between the Palestinians. And for the moment, they're creating this ceasefire between them. But ultimately, for peace to win, the moderates have to win, the extremists have to lose.
What about the situation in terms of future policy? I mean, in fact, in terms of reading what your press spokesman said, you actually would not want a Palestinian state, or he said a Palestinian entity, or a Palestinian anything. I mean, you actually don't want a Palestinian state under any circumstances. Is that right?
No, that's not true. I think I'd want an arrangement where the Palestinians govern themselves, but in such a way that they do not threaten us. And I would, remember, I'm the one who negotiated measured agreements with the Palestinians. And during the 3 years that I was prime minister, we had the greatest growth of the Palestinian economy since the Oslo days, because I insisted on security, but I opened up the markets. This is what I believe in. And it benefited us, and it benefited our Palestinian neighbors. I want them to govern themselves. No sane Israeli leader, I consider myself perfectly sane, will want to reincorporate the Palestinian cities make them part of Israel. They have to govern themselves. They have to live side by side with us. But the problem we face now, David, there and elsewhere in the Arab world and in Iran, is that you have a stream of militant ideologues, primarily militant Islamic ideologues, who are basically saying, skip coexistence with Israel, skip coexistence with other Muslims, skip coexistence with the world. And they're bringing tragedy to their own peoples and pushing peace further away. That's what Hamas is doing here. That's what Hezbollah is doing in Lebanon. And I believe that's what Iran is doing throughout the Middle East. So I think that at the end of the day, it's not merely what we in Israel do vis-a-vis the Palestinians. I hope we find moderate partners, and I certainly would like to make peace with them. It'll be a tough negotiation, but it'll come out eventually. If you have partners on the other side who want to make peace with us, the experience of Anwar Sadat in Egypt, the experience of the late King Hussein in Jordan have shown that regardless of who's in power in Israel, a Likud government under Menachem Begin or a Labour government under Yitzhak Rabin, when you have a partner for peace, Israel makes peace. What we lack now is a partner for peace amidst the Palestinians.
And in terms of the future, the immediate future, what can be done, do you think, at the meeting between Condoleezza Rice, Mahmoud Abbas and Ehud Olmert that would represent progress? Or is the only progress that you can foresee is the next move comes from the Palestinians, you would probably say? But what can those three people do when they meet this weekend?
Abbas should say unequivocally that he will not sanction a government, he will not endorse a government that does not explicitly recognize the state of Israel. What have we been talking about all these years? We've talked about peace. How can they expect us to make peace with somebody who doesn't recognize our right to exist? I certainly recognize the right of the Palestinian people to exist, to govern themselves, to have a future for their children, to have a better life, to have an economy that is free of corruption and these terrible policies that I see around us. I'd like them to partake in the progress that we have in Israel. But for that to happen, they also must make a decision. Abbas has to make that decision, to stand up for the right things, not to be carried away with the wrong things. And I really want to use this opportunity. I'm talking to you, David, but through you, I'm talking to our Palestinian neighbors. I'm talking to perhaps the people of Iran, some of whom are listening to us. And I'd like to tell them, you can have a choice. You can. There can be peace between us, but you have to make sure that the moderate forces that want progress, that want an end to these backward, militant, ideological regimes, that you prevail, the forces of progress and peace. And it's a decision that has to be made in Iran, it has to be made in Lebanon, it has to be made by the Palestinians. It's already been made by us. We want peace with those who want peace with us.
One thing that interrupts that process a bit is, like, for instance, the Lebanon war and the destruction of the Lebanese infrastructure, and the fact that it's always, in any clash between the Palestinians and the Israelis, it's always at least 4-1 in terms of fatalities against the Palestinians and so on. When you're pleading for moderation from the extreme Arabs, does there not be a concomitant need for the same thing from the military side of Israel?
Well, yes, but remember that in the case of the Second Lebanon War, Hezbollah, totally unprovoked, launched 4,000 rockets on Israel. 4,000 rockets. That's equivalent, actually identical, to the number of rockets fired by the Germans on London and British cities in World War II. Now, if I compare Israel's response to the response of the British government, it is disproportionately low. That is an understatement. I mean, Churchill, and I don't blame him right now, I'm not getting into that discussion, but Churchill wiped out Dresden and entire German cities and caused hundreds of thousands of casualties. That wasn't the case here. Israel didn't use a modicum of its power. Now, having said that, I have to tell you, I think just about every Israeli is sorry, genuinely sorry, for any civilian death. But I think that one of the things that we have to recognize is that we were fired upon from populated areas, from built-up areas, and we simply tried to knock out those stations. I think the real solution is to make sure that rockets are not fired from one country into another, and then we wouldn't have to respond. But then again, that relates to that basic power struggle that is taking place right now in Lebanon. Iran is trying to use Hezbollah to turn Lebanon into an Islamic republic. The people who are hearing us right now, just the fact that they're hearing us and listening to this channel, they don't want that. Arabs and Muslims who are listening to us right now, the overwhelming majority do not want that to happen. And if it doesn't happen, if Hezbollah is stopped, Iran is stopped, then rockets will not be fired, we won't retaliate, and what's more important is that we could have the kind of future of prosperous exchanges between us that we all dream about. I dream about. For God's sake, I like to visit Beirut, just driving along the coast in a very nice car and meeting Lebanese people, and I think they'd like to come to Haifa and Tel Aviv. But they're prevented by the fact that you know that the people of Lebanon want that. You know that the majority want it. There's a moderate, responsible government there trying to establish itself, and you know who doesn't want it. Hezbollah and Iran doesn't want it. That's the same battle that is going on in the Palestinian society. It's the same battle that is going on in Iran itself, where a minority, the Ayatollah minority, is trying to govern an entire people, a great nation with great capacities, and turn it into a pre-medieval backward regime. I really think it goes beyond the Arab-Israeli question. It goes into the larger question of what is happening in Islam itself, what is happening in the Arab world itself. And I, for one, am rooting for the moderates, even if they won't admit that they're rooting for us.
We thank you, and we look forward to doing this again. Thank you very much indeed.